Hi, I want to walk you through some of the readings in section C and D of chapter 4, the idea of truth, starting with Immanuel Kant. Now, you saw in the earlier video the distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. A priori is prior to any experience of the senses. A posteriori follows after sense observation, the same way that your posterior follows the rest of you into the room. The question is there any such thing as synthetic a priori knowledge? Synthetic is where the predicate, the description, adds something to the subject, as opposed to an analytic truth, which is basically where the predicate simply defines the subject, like all bachelors are unmarried men. Unmarried men doesn't add anything to the concept of bachelor. It simply defines it. It analyzes what it means. And that's the problem with Anselm's proof for the existence of God. It doesn't really add anything to the definition. Kant thinks there is, and I want to kind of briefly try to explain how that works. Kant distinguishes between what he calls the noumena, the object out there that we perceive. He sometimes uses the German phrase Ding an sich, thing in itself. And we really can't know that, because all we can know is the phenomena, the thing as we perceive it. But we perceive it through a kind of filter, the categories of that our mind uses to interpret what we are seeing. I see a shape. The upright line is a grayish tan. Coming out from it are branches and green leaves. I interpret it as a tree. I may even identify the kind of tree it is. We perceive everything through these filters, these lenses, like I see the world through the lenses of my glasses. And there's no way for us to kind of step outside of our mind and perceive the thing as it is in itself. We have only our perception of it, and our mind interprets it using these categories. Now, Kant thinks that these categories are universal, and they are necessary by reason. And this is how he responds to David Hume from the previous lesson, who, for example, said we associate certain things by force of habit, but we never actually see, for example, one thing cause another. All we ever can see is one thing happening and then the other, and if that first thing is in our experience always followed by the second, then we link them up by force of habit. Kant says, no, it's more than that. It's genuine knowledge. The idea of cause and effect is one of these categories that our mind uses to structure, to understand, to make sense out of our experiences. And they're necessary, Kant thinks. And so we are, in your textbook phrase, constituting our world. We actually make our world. by the mind interpreting our observations. And so, page 272, he says, all our knowledge begins with experience, but it does not follow that it rises from experience. Our mind is adding something to the sense impressions, and it always does. We do not have just naked sense impressions. They're always filtered. They're always interpreted. Our knowledge supplies from within itself a supplement that we really can't separate from the raw material of our empirical experience, our sense data, what I'm seeing. I can only see through that a priori knowledge that the mind supplies, categorizing, labeling, interpreting. And on page 274, he actually talks about this idea of our connection of cause and effect. It's not something that we derive from experience, as Hume recognized, but it comes, Kant says, from pure understanding. And so these categories that we use to interpret are necessarily true. They're the rules by which we interpret our experience, and we have to interpret. And so reality and truth then are not something out there for us to discover. Rather, they are in our mind. And this creates the problem that is going to follow Kant, page 275. What about different people, and maybe even different kinds of creatures? Will they use the same rules to interpret? Kant seems to think that they have to. There can only be one set of rules. Other philosophers are not so certain, and that leads them to a kind of relativism, where, truth is what a particular community understands it to be. Now, that's not quite the same thing as subjectivism. Subjectivism is where, whatever I feel is true for me. Most philosophers aren't going to agree with that. But the debate rages between those like Kant, who argue that these rules are transcendent over any particular culture, and those who are going to argue that they are relative to any particular culture. And that's the discussion on page 276 between absolutists and relativists. Absolutists are those who think that there is only one truth. Relativists say that there are many truths. Now, one attempt to bridge that gap, page 277, is Hegel. Hegel is going to argue that there is a kind of universal spirit in which we all participate, we share in. which is working its way to more and more adequate understandings. Hegel is going to add the concept of historical development into epistemology and philosophy in general. That over time, the human spirit, if you will, is growing in its understanding. And this works in a process called dialectic, where there's an understanding, and then you may have heard this called thesis, and then there's an antithesis. There's something that challenges that, and then some new synthesis arises, which combines the two. In a way, Kant is combining empiricism and rationalism into a new synthesis, which in Hegel's view then becomes the new thesis, and the process repeats over and over. Past understandings in Hegel's way of thinking are not so much false as they are limited, and they become transcended. The German word is aufgehoben, leftover. That traces of earlier understandings stay in our new understanding. On page 279, he introduces a dilemma that empiricism doesn't get at a thing itself, and rationalism only gives us knowledge of our ideas. But for Hegel, reality is ultimately ideas. In fact, he's called an absolute idealist. That reality is the product of the cosmic mind. He uses the word spirit, in German Geist, which is the same as our word ghost. And it's this difference between ourselves and understanding that Hegel wants to overcome. And on page 280 is where he talks about this consciousness developing through stages in its journey towards a fuller, more complete understanding. And so modern skepticism leads us to realize that truth is evolving through this dialectic process. Through an idea and its opposite, which negates it, and transforming into a new synthesis. And this being in itself, as it's evolving, is called truth. It's called knowledge. But it's always in process. It's always developing. And our forms of consciousness, page 282, are developing towards a fuller, more complete understanding. Now, Hegel recognizes that this process in which reason is working itself out in history is going to be a messy business, because reason is working itself out through human passions and interests and characters and will. And it had to be that way. It's the only way it could have happened. And he knows that history is full of miseries. But it's the only way we can get from where we started to where we are going and trying to get to. Page 285. Reason governs the world and has consequently governed its history. In relation to this reason, and our translation here is a little misleading, it capitalizes reason, makes it sound almost like it's God. Hegel wrote in German, and in German you capitalize all nouns. But his idea is that reason is working out this fuller understanding of the human spirit, of human existence, and the process, while it's undeniably messy, could not have happened another way. Given, I guess, human nature and human understandings being limited at the time. You know, we only really understand things in hindsight. But reason is striving towards this ultimate goal of full and complete understanding. One of Hegel's followers, Karl Marx, turns Hegel on its head. He adopts the idea of dialectic, but he says what's evolving is not understanding and ideas, as Hegel thought, but rather economic systems. For Marx, the economic system essentially creates the ideas that support it. And this leads to a view of history defining each society by who controls what Marx calls the means of production. In earlier societies, the farmland; in modern industrial society, the factories. In the beginning, Marx says there was primitive communism, a kind of tribal society where the community controls the resources. If you may have learned in American history that the Dutch bought Manhattan Island for $24 worth of trinkets. Well, the reason for that is that the Native Americans had no concept of buying and selling land. The idea of people owning land was like people owning air to them. Now, the tribal group controlled land, but they shared it among themselves as a group. They their understanding was that you're building relationships by exchanging gifts. Well, as that kind of society grows, what tends to happen is that the chief, who really has no power, he's simply respected because people respect his leadership, becomes a king who has real power. And the next step Marxist historians call slave society. Think New Kingdom Egypt, where the pharaoh owns the land and owns the country, and theoretically everybody is working for the pharaoh. As that kind of society grows, it gets too big for one person to manage himself, and so you get the rise of a new class, the nobles, who eventually rise up and assert their rights over against the king, and so you get the next stage, which is feudal society. Think the European Middle Ages, where the English nobles, for example, forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which had nothing, guaranteed certain rights for the nobles. It was nothing about the common people. Well, as that feudal aristocratic society grows, you get the growth of modern cities, and in them a new class over against the aristocracy of the merchants and businessmen. Marx calls them the bourgeois or bourgeoisie, from the French word for people who live in cities. And when they rise up again and assert their rights over against the ruling aristocracy in like the American and French revolutions, you get the rise of the next stage, which is bourgeois capitalism, where the factories are owned by wealthy individuals, business types. Now, that's the phase of society that we're in the modern West in Marx's analysis. And so I'm going to take a minute to talk about that. What happens under bourgeois capitalism is that more and more wealth gets concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, because you get the Industrial Revolution, you get mass production, and goods can be produced cheaper on a large scale in the factories than they could on a small scale individuals making things. This is why if you lived in a small town, when the big box store comes in, a lot of the mom and pop stores go out of business because they cannot compete, because the big box store can sell goods cheaper than the mom and pop can. And so people from all classes wind up having to sell their labor and become what Marx calls proletarians. By Marx's definition, I'm a proletarian because I do not own the canvas system that you're using to take these classes, the buildings that I used to teach in when I was able to teach classes in person. I am selling my labor, my time, to the university. And Marx thinks that the worker gets ripped off because he winds up having to sell his labor for less than it's truly worth. The way Marx figures it, the value of anything is made up of two things only: the value of the raw materials that go into it and the value of the labor that turns those raw materials into a finished product. Let's say this shirt I'm wearing, let's say I paid $20 for it. That's its value. And let's say that the cloth that it's made from costs $5. Well, Marx figures the value then of the labor that turned that cloth into a shirt that I could put on today is $15. But the worker doesn't get $15. Let's say the worker gets $5 for making this shirt. Well, I paid $20. $5 went for the cloth it was made from. $5 went to the worker who made it. Where'd the other $10 go? Marx says it goes to the factory owner. Now, why does the worker have to sell his labor for less than it's worth? Well, the answer is that he cannot afford the expensive, complex machinery that it takes to mass produce these shirts. And he has to sell his labor for less than it's worth, because if he doesn't, somebody else will take that job instead. One of the things that happens in modern industrial society is that there are always more people than there are jobs. We call the difference the unemployment rate. It is never zero. In Marx's time, it was called surplus population, which is a scary thought, because if it's surplus, you can get rid of it, right? Basically, if I don't sell my labor making shirts at $5 a shirt, somebody else will take that job, and then I don't have any way at all to support myself and my family, and I starve. And there was no security net in Marx's time. As bad as it is today, it was worse then. And so for Marx, what's driving this development is conflict between classes. And in the end, the proletarians will rise up against the bourgeoisie, take over control of the means of production. Basically, what he has in mind is something like the United Auto Workers owning Ford, Chrysler, and GM. Ideas, and specifically religion, in Marx's view, is, as he puts it, the opiate of the people. It is a drug that the ruling classes give to the workers to take their minds off their suffering and to legitimize the social structure. For example, in ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh owns all of Egypt because he is seen as a god. And Marx analyzes all religions, every religion, that way. He doesn't care one religion versus another. All religion, in Marx's view, is a tool that the ruling class uses to prop themselves up. Now, while I think that there's some things that are interesting and about Marx, and he has some points, I think his theory is overly simplistic. For one thing, his analysis completely leaves out the cost of distributing goods. He doesn't factor that in at all, but that's actually part of what we're paying for when we buy something, is the way in which it is distributed from the manufacturer to the consumer. Last thing for this session, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is really not interested in truth. He's interested in will. He accepts that we organize our world by our understanding of it, as all modern philosophers do. But he's not interested in which view of the world is true. He's interested in what kind of person would need to believe that. For Nietzsche, the criterion of truth, page 287, is the enhancement of the feeling of power. What empowers us to achieve our goals, our desires, and he, page 287, how the true world became a fable, the history of an error. He sketches out stages in understanding. The first one, the true world is attainable for the wise, the powerful, the pious, the virtuous. He lives in it. This is basically Plato and Aristotle, the striving for excellence. Stage two is, I think, Christianity. The true world is unattainable for now because it's in heaven, not on earth. But it's promised for the wise, the the pious, the virtuous. And Nietzsche is seeing this as a downfall, a decaying, because he views Christianity as the epitome of what he calls slave morality, the moral values of the weak rather than of the strong, that values kindness and mercy rather than excellence. The third, the giveaway, is the last part of the description, Kantian. The true world is unattainable, indemonstrable, unpromisable, but the very thought of it is a duty, an imperative. This is Kant. These are the necessary categories of reason. We will talk when we get about Kant's ethics and the categorical imperative later in the course. Then number 4 is Hegel. That it's the true world is unattained, and we don't know where it's going. Hegel famously said the owl of Minerva, understanding, flies at dusk. I think the 5th one refers to Marx, actually, that the ideas are worthless and superfluous. Let's abolish it. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Nietzsche, I think, is seeing himself in the 6th one. We have, and look at the videos on Nietzsche here. We have abolished the crutches. We abolished the idea of God. We are on our own to make life meaningful and to pursue the empty truth. See you next time.